Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously Monday that states lack the power to reject presidential candidates on the grounds that they engaged in rebellion or insurrection against the United States, a decision that restored former President Donald Trump's name to Colorado's ballot and ended similar challenges to his candidacy elsewhere. The next day, Super Tuesday, Trump and Biden won everywhere except Vermont in Trump's case and American Samoa in Biden's. So unless special counsel Jack Smith can get his election interference case decided before November, Walter, it looks like a rerun of 2020 is all but official at this point. I think we've all seen this coming for a while, so I'll ask you, in the grand scheme of things like of American history, is our impending doom of Trump v. Biden at this point news or faux news?
Well, news, there's that word new that's so fundamental to the point of the word news. And this is, most of us have thought right from 2020 that this was what we were headed for. And lo and behold, here we are. Yeah, I would say faux news in that sense, or old news.
All right, our second story. Israeli War Cabinet Minister and opposition leader Benny Gantz was in Washington this week, where he reportedly came under heavy pressure from Kamala Harris, Jake Sullivan, Antony Blinken, and Lloyd Austin. According to Axios, Gantz, quote, wasn't only surprised by the strength of criticism about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but also about how far apart Israel and the U.S. are when it comes to a possible operation in Rafah, close quote. Gantz's trip also reportedly angered Benjamin Netanyahu, who had not authorized the trip. It's well known that the Biden administration would prefer Gantz, who's been open about his own desire to unseat Netanyahu even from within the war cabinet. Walter, is this news or faux news?
I think it's I would say on the whole faux news, in the sense that there's more signaling than substance going on. It frankly looks good for the Americans to be criticizing Israel over humanitarian issues in Gaza. It looks good for an Israeli politician to be standing up against American pressure. I imagine Bibi was not thrilled that Gantz got to play the role of Israeli standing firm against American attacks. But it should, to some degree, underline the reality that getting Bibi out is not likely to make a big change in the U.S.-Israel relationship, because the things that Washington really doesn't like about Bibi right now are basically the things about Bibi that are popular in Israel. That is the determination to prosecute the war in Gaza, real reluctance to see anything like a Palestinian state emerging quickly, and a willingness to push harder against Hezbollah in the north if there's no alternative. And I think you could say that behind all of that, the division is still really, the White House, I think, would like to see a lot of localized problems in the Middle East, the Houthis here, Hamas there, Hezbollah there. And it would really just like to keep the Middle East as quiet as possible, while Israel sees itself being sort of encircled by this Iranian operation, which is strategically aimed at destroying Israel en route to domination of the Middle East. The Israelis see that as an existential threat and are trying to respond to it. The Biden administration just doesn't want a lot of trouble before the election.
One follow-up there. There have been a lot of reports from the Israeli press recently about the country's moves to ramp up domestic arms production. So they're moving off the U.S.-made M4 carbine to be replaced with an Israeli version next year. They've also set up production lines to replace one-ton bombs currently supplied by the U.S., albeit the major Israeli defense contractor, I think, just set up a joint venture with an Indian defense company to increase production. So my question is all this just broadly about supply and demand during a time of war, especially with tensions rising in southern Lebanon? Or is this more specifically about Israel wanting to maybe lighten its dependence on the United States in particular for its ability to defend itself?
The more likely war is, the more you start thinking about the security of your supply chains and the supply of munitions. If you're in Israel and you're looking at the possibility of repeated outbreaks of war with an ascendant Iran, you want to have all the kit you can have. It's also true that you've got your arms budget, anything you spend on foreign arms is essentially money that leaves your country. Anything that you spend on domestic arms, you're developing a domestic industry, which can then be used for export. And Israel has been very successful in the past at exporting arms. First of all, this won't do anything about the current war in Gaza. There's no way at this point you fight with the logistics chain that you have. And there's really no way that in a policy relevant time they can start replacing American weapons on any significant scale with Israeli ones. But long term, if you're going to be fighting a lot of these wars, the Israeli defense industry wants to build up. The Indian defense industry is very interested in deepening its cooperation with Israel. So I think I don't think we have to read too much foreign policy stuff into this, but obviously, if you're Israel, you want to make sure that when you need stuff, you can get it.
All right, final story of the week. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the US and the global economy experienced a China shock, a boom in imports of cheap Chinese-made goods that helped keep inflation low but at the cost of local manufacturing jobs. A sequel to the China shock, according to the Wall Street Journal, may be in the making as Beijing doubles down on exports to revive the country's growth. Its factories are churning out more cars, more machinery, and more consumer electronics than its domestic economy can absorb. Propped up by cheap, state-directed loans, Chinese companies are glutting foreign markets with products they can't sell at home. Some economists see this potential China shock 2.0 pushing inflation down even more than the first. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, there's so much analysis in that quote story, some of it accurate, some of it not, that it's sort of as a whole confection, I think it's a little bit faux news. There, for example, the idea that it was simply China that destroyed manufacturing jobs in the 90s and 2000s. Automation was moving really quickly. And it's also true that the cheapness of Chinese manufacturing actually increased demand for manufactured goods around the world. If you can reduce the cost of making ballpoint pens by 50%, more people in more places can buy them. So I think there's and you'll hear it in Team Trump and Team Biden, a desire to take a totally reductionist view that every widget that China makes is bad for America in some ways. And we should try to fight that, even as we recognize the very real geopolitical stakes and, in some cases, legitimate supply chain security issues, and obviously also dumping and things, subsidized credit. So I don't want us to go necessarily there. And I guess I would also say that China has really a huge problem on its hands. I mean, it has several problems, but one of them is that manufacturing is not as good a strategy for making yourself a rich country now as it was when Taiwan and Japan and South Korea were doing it. For one thing, it's now so easy to move manufacturing to cheaper wage countries that if Chinese wages start to go up, well, Bangladesh gets a massive influx of investment, which is already happening in low-wage industries like textiles. So that it's really hard to preserve an advantage. And I think we're looking at what you could call the commoditization of manufacturing, where it's so easy for so many producers in so many countries to produce manufactured goods. And, remember in the 1950s and 60s, there are only a few countries with the infrastructure, with the know-how, with the legal framework, all of the things that you actually need for manufacturing on a large scale. Now it's becoming an almost universal thing, which means the markup is less. What happened in the West is that while we were still leading the world in manufacturing in the decades right after World War II, the very, very large returns on those kinds of goods enabled us to pay a higher social wage, to increase, Social Security, Medicare, these kinds of things. Arguably, we haven't really quite figured out how to pay for them, but that's a little different. We were able to build this. We were able to fund the massive environmental cleanups. I mean, young people today have no idea how dirty the rivers and the air were 50 years ago. We were able to clean that stuff up without totally destroying our living standard. So, and also American wages were able to go up. So China would like to do that, but I think it's going to be hard to do. The analogy that comes to my mind is Argentina and other places that in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, it led to a huge manufacturing boom. You had, on the one hand, a lot of of industrial workers leaving the country to live in towns, cities, and all those workers in Frankfurt who aren't growing food anymore still need to eat. The Industrial Revolution then enables, with larger ships, railroads, places like Argentina in the Pampas that were not really able to farm or to market to the world economy. Now Argentina could sell to all those workers in Europe, could sell to the US. So you actually had, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, a massive agricultural boom driven by rising productivity, innovation, and so on. But ultimately what happens is you get, the price of growing food just collapses. I mean, today we grow more food than we ever did, with only 2% or less of the population actually doing it, while in the 1850 it took half the population to feed the other half. And so the countries that went all in for agriculture had a great time up through about World War I. And then their terms of trade with the rest of the world gradually declined. Now, China knows this history and they're thinking about it. So they've been trying to do high-tech financial services and things like that. They'll have some success. But I think their overall development model is not going to get them is unlikely to get them as rich as it got the Japanese. And to some degree, what we see in China may be early signs of it running out of gas. I don't know. So yes, there is massive overproduction of goods in China, but what's going to happen is they're not going to be able to sell them for large profits. So you'll be working really hard, spewing pollution into your air, into the rivers, having your workers frantically working at not very good wages in not very nice conditions. And all of this activity, like a hamster running on a wheel, is not going to be generating something that's actually going to help you as much as you need it to. So I think China still has a lot of readjustment, and it's going to be difficult.
Just quickly before we move on from China, there was an interesting factoid I saw that kind of slightly related to what we were just talking about. The National People's Congress had its annual legislative session this week, and in the report delivered by the Chinese premier, the word security apparently appeared more than in any previous People's Congress since, 1954 or whatever. I don't know whether that was about internal security or national security or maybe both, but what does that make you think, if anything?
I think it's been evidently clear since Xi Jinping rose to power that the Chinese establishment is running on fear of external competition, fear of internal dissension and internal chaos. I have to imagine the combination of the COVID shock and the economic shocks of the last few years have in no way calmed those fears. And they face an international situation where there are more powers more hostile to China than ever before. They cannot be happy with all of this.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So this week, Walter, I wanted to take a look at the state of the green movement or the climate movement or whatever you want to call it, because we do seem to be at a kind of pivotal stage for green politics as a massive global and civil society movement, maybe the biggest one of at least my lifetime. So in Germany, the Green Party's popularity is plunging. In Portugal, the green-friendly left is running way behind the center-right and even far-right. The pro-green socialist-led government in Spain is in trouble. Italy's Green Party's polling under 5%, similar trends in Switzerland and elsewhere. And also this year, it's worth mentioning, many of the world's biggest carbon-emitting countries and territories have major elections. The US, India, Indonesia, the European Union, and I guess Russia, if we want to call those elections. But I'd say climate change is not an issue at all in at least 3 of those countries. And in the US even, it seems to be less of an issue now than at any time before maybe Obama's first campaign back in 2008. Biden, I'm sure, will campaign on the Inflation Reduction Act, but I assume mostly as a kind of protectionist manufacturing job creating program, not as a wonderful package of green subsidies or an anti-fossil fuel program. So what does this mean for many of us who, since, middle school or even earlier, have seen the green movement as kind of the integral issue for center-left and also just broadly centrist political coalitions in the Western world?
It has to be a shock for a lot of folks in the green movement whose basic calculation has long been that as the signs of climate change grew clearer, the political will to do something about it would grow. What we're actually seeing is that's not happening, that the signs of climate change are clearer. Just ask anybody in Florida who's trying to get insurance for a home, and the costs are more evident in that way. But the political will to do something doesn't really seem to be going very, moving in step with that. And again, I think, there's several things at work here. One is there's never really been a lot of political will to do something about the climate. There's always, there's a certain amount of political will of saying things that will make the Greens happy, or at least make them go away and go bother someone else. So we have all of these pledges: climate neutrality, net zero, 2050, 2060, whatever. They all seem to involve doing nothing or very little right now, and then doing a whole lot 10 years from now or whatever. And so, that's classically the way a political system responds to a strong minority demand, is to come up with something that will keep them quiet, but not involve significant costs. And what's happening, particularly in Europe, where the green movement has been much more effective politically than in the US, is that the pledges are starting to cost people money. In Germany, I think it was this issue of every house is going to have to put in a heat pump. In other countries, it's agriculture has played a huge role, where, again, somehow mysteriously the cost of green things should not be borne by commuters in cities, but by farmers out there. That's a problem in 2 ways for the green movement. One is that the farm vote remains important in Europe. Just look at how the European Union spends its budget, how much of that is actually for farm subsidies. But also the green movement, in its origin, farmers were a really important part of the green movement in Europe from the beginning. And it was partly about agricultural protectionism. No GMOs, no frankenfoods, no factory farming, blah, 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 so that we can protect the artisanal quality of European farms, i.e., the ability of European farmers to charge much higher prices for the goods that they produce than you would get if you had actual free trade in agriculture. And so the farmers' desire for that kind of agricultural conservation with the green sort of overall thing kind of meshed and made the green movement a mass political force. So with the farmers walking away from it, then you have the problem is that the green movement becomes more and more a movement of the upper middle class, urban sophisticates. And as we kind of see, that's a group that's incredibly powerful in the world of media, in the world of NGOs, in the world of, what good people think, but often does surprisingly poorly when it comes to votes. And with green policies having a greater and greater impact on voters, so that it becomes so resistance to green policy becomes more politically salient. I think I think the movement is in for some rethinking. That's only one, I think, of the problems they're facing. Another is, I think we've all heard the phrase green jobs and how many fabulous green jobs. I'm afraid I've always been a little skeptic about this. I kept saying, if China can produce everything else cheaper, what's going to keep them from producing solar panels and EVs and all of these fabulous, fabulous green? Why? What is there magical about being green that ensures that it'll be made in the Netherlands and not in China? And the answer is there is nothing. There is nothing. And in fact, the Chinese, with their sort of move toward industrial planning, can look at these green things, pledges and so on, and figure out in a much more efficient. You're actually creating an environment that is ideal for Chinese state planned and subsidized industry. The German car industry has woken up with just an absolute horrible hangover as it's realized this is exactly what Germany has done. It has incentivized the Chinese destruction of German industry on a vast scale. So, the green movement, unfortunately, is not very good at understanding the dynamics of complex systems, which should be the core skill of an ecologically driven movement. But they haven't thought hard about the side effects, the consequences. And so what they have is a shopping list of really nifty ideas, but not an actual program for effectively reshaping modern economies, developing economies. So what I think we're seeing is, in a sense, green intellectual laziness, sort of being hit by the reality of the actual complexity of a global economic system that billions of people depend on for their living. Now, obviously, as a climate activist would respond at this point, but that doesn't make the problem of climate change go away. And the answer is no, it doesn't. I've often thought about European green policies the way I did about the euro, which there used to be a huge debate. Will the Europeans ever be able to do the euro? And a lot of sort of Anglo-Saxon free market people, looking at what a crazy idea it was, said, no, it's not an ideal currency area. So then I looked at it and I said, well, actually, they're going to do it because they really want to do it, but it won't make them happy. And I think that's a lot of European green policy is in that same category. They had the political will to put a lot of stuff into place, but as they start living with the consequences, they are not happy with the world that they've created.
You mentioned Germany, where the Green Party, I think, is bleeding support from frustrated environmentalists, and the center-right Christian Democrats are now in kind of open revolt against all things green, and the AfD is, of course, benefiting from the backlash. Do you see a possibility for that kind of polarization along green lines, splitting the center and center-left in America, or do you think figures like Biden and Jake Sullivan have kind of managed the green issue a lot more deftly and carefully along the lines of what you discussed before, kind of just doing just enough to make the environmental wing of the party satisfied and quiet, and otherwise making it about manufacturing jobs and so on?
That's hard to say. I mean, I think it is true that America has done less green policy than Europe has. And so we're experiencing less anti-green backlash than Europe is. And, whether that's due to the caution of the politicians or just the fact that the American political system is one which is just really hard to get things done, I can't tell you. But you can see it in terms for the Democratic Party, it's going to be a problem. I mean, I look at back when you and I were working on Via Media in the old days, we used to look at the high-speed rail in California. And we made a lot of people very unhappy by saying this is going to end up costing like much more than you think it is. And it's going to be built really slowly, if at all. And by the time it's actually there, people won't be riding it as much because we'll be doing virtual meetings rather than traveling from San Francisco to Los Angeles by train. All of which I think, remain really good calls. But the thing is that when you think about the Democratic Party in California, what can unify that party? Well, the Greens have to be made happy and the unions have to be made happy. And what does that get you? Well, high-speed rail is one of the few big construction projects that would create a lot of jobs. And yet the Greens are going to say, oh, hallelujah, this is so beautiful. It's not like you're building some disgusting, dam or, highway or some evil planet destroying thing. So it makes it really hard to come up with and the high-speed rail, again, is a perfect example of a beautiful project considered from a political point of view, which simply doesn't work in the actual world. And to the extent that the green influence in Democratic Party thinking keeps forcing people into sort of visionary ideas that, again, oh my goodness, you put it on a whiteboard, you do a PowerPoint, and it just glistens with brilliance. But it just is too complicated and too delicate and too many moving parts to actually institute. I tend to think that humanity, again, is not very good at avoiding problems by preventing them. Our genius as a species is for adaptation, not prevention. That is not the smartest way to be, perhaps, and not the cheapest way, but it's what we as a species do best. And my guess is that we'll come up with some new technologies better than the stuff that we see now that actually does reduce energy intensity. We will figure out new ways of doing insurance markets, or we'll just stop building really fancy, expensive houses on low-lying coasts and hurricane-prone zones. We'll adapt our crops so that we can grow more crops in hotter climates. I mean, this is what we do. Will it be expensive? Yes. Is it optimal? No. But again, I think the Greens have not looked at some of the ways in which the problem has actually become, and I won't say solving itself because it's not like that. But if you think about the way that in the last few years we've ratcheted down our estimates for both China's population and China's GDP growth, all right, you really feed that back into climate models. And you get a very different look at the world. So I tend to think that what will ultimately drive the course of the planet's climate has a lot to do with developments that at the moment we're not able to anticipate. Some of them will be positive, some of them will be negative. But actually, where we are in 2040 is going to be quite different from where we are in 2024, opportunities and dangers, liabilities and assets. And adaptation will probably be the fudge factor that moves us forward.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this time from Abby in Rotterdam, who I assume saw your most recent column and wrote in to ask, what are the best books for understanding capitalism? I love the idea, Walter, of a Dutchman or Dutchwoman asking you where capitalism comes from.
Well, I would say, my book, God and Gold, is not a bad history of the intersection of capitalism and world power. There's like Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. That's also a really good book. Dutch history is a rich source of information about capitalism. I wouldn't presume to tell a Dutch person what the best books of Dutch history are, but I think another one, the guy who wrote it was not a particularly convinced capitalist. He was sort of a democratic socialist, but Robert Heilbronner's Worldly Philosophers is a really well-written intellectual history of modern economics, going up, I guess, roughly to the Keynesian era. And so while he's not a unqualified cheerleader by any means, if you want to understand some of the ideas, that's probably a good place to begin.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.